The following program features archival footage from World War II. All of the images are real. Some are extremely graphic. Viewer discretion is advised.
The Pacific Ocean. This vast body of water is dotted with chains of idyllic islands. But in 1942, it becomes engulfed in flames and soaked in blood.
If anybody ever tells you they weren't scared, they're liars.
In this film, we explore the conflict between Japan and the United States as they battle on the sea and in the skies across the Pacific.
The critical thing in the end for Japanese and American soldiers was just killing the enemy, one way or another.
Featuring newsreel of the time, rare and enhanced archive footage, and the testimonies of those who were there.
The Japanese came up with the kamikaze point.
They circled around, came back, and one of them hit the ammunition ship on our starboard side.
This is World War II, Witness to War. Japan, 1942. Following the attacks on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japan is officially at war with the United States. As the Emperor Hirohito tries to expand his empire, it seems as if nothing can stand in the way of the Japanese military. One by one, they successfully seized the European colonies in Southeast Asia and forced the United States out of the Philippines, paving the way for Japan to control many of the island chains in the Pacific.
One thing that you will notice if you look at the areas the Japanese occupy at this time is that many of the territories, if not most of them, actually have nothing to offer the empire in terms of material or labor or even food. They're strategically important. You can't ship oil from Indonesia without having the Philippines secured on your flank.
The Japanese goal of occupying, stationing troops, and kind of digging into those islands is to keep the US from getting close enough to Japan that it would be able to launch an air attack.
Therefore, it's crucial for Japan's Imperial Navy to take control of the seas. It sends many British, Australian, and Dutch ships to the bottom of the ocean. Leading the Pacific campaign is Japan's senior admiral, Yamamoto Isoroku.
Yamamoto Isoroku was a very intelligent man, a very good naval strategist, perhaps one of the best in the world.
And he knows the biggest threat to Japan is the United States.
Yamamoto's plans revolved around making the war difficult for Americans, particularly in terms of lives lost and wealth dispensed. He thought the Japanese could eventually bring the Americans to a negotiating table.
But in order for Yamamoto's plan to work, Japan must utilize the resources from its new territories in Southeast Asia.
Gold and iron and timber of the Philippines, the oil and quinine of the Dutch East Indies, all the raw materials needed to make Japan self-sufficient in a war which many of its leaders believe may last a century.
And raw materials aren't the only resource on which Japan relies.
While the Japanese Empire used all the natural resources in Asia to further their aims, they also used human resources, and they did so in a very focused and appalling way.
While prisoners of war are sent to slave labor camps, Asian women become a target for Japanese cruelty. They're referred to as comfort women.
Not only did the Japanese army permit and even encourage rape of women in occupied populations, but they even made the rape systematic by repeatedly putting women at the sexual mercy of Japanese soldiers in camps and in organized brothels for the duration of the war.
Soldiers came into my room, horrifying and terrifying me. I cried and tried to run away. The manager slapped my cheek until my nose bled. And while crying, I became a tool of the sexual appetites of the soldiers. I was forced to service 12 soldiers every day, and some of them demanded dominant and barbaric sexual acts. It was truly an unbearable life.
Back in Tokyo, the government celebrates the ever-growing empire and victories at sea. However, Japan's civilian population is living a different reality.
From 1938, there are a never-expanding list of rationing that the Japanese will be exposed to. Oil, how much food, how much flour, how much rice, how much sake.
Ordinary Japanese believe that rationing is a small price to pay for the glory of their emperor.
There are a lot of people that find their calling or find themselves in support of the war and the war aim. So on one hand, while Japan does go through great economic difficulty, there is no mass exodus of intellectuals and no mass exodus of many other people as well.
Propaganda plays an important role in keeping the Japanese population focused on victory.
In the theaters of Japan, Nazi methods of propaganda are also copied. For throughout its modern history, Japan has been a totalitarian state preparing for total war.
You had to send off the soldiers and welcome them back. And you had to volunteer to make money to send to the military. We did things to comfort soldiers. We collected small things to send to them, bought canned goods, made comfort bags, and wrote comfort letters. If you had a family with a man who hadn't gone to the front, you were all right. But in those days, there weren't any families with a man. Everybody was gone.
One of the interesting things in looking at Japanese wartime propaganda is examining the role of mothers. That the mothers are not weeping as their sons, or they're sending off their sons, but they're quite pleased in sacrifice of the country. And one finds, we see this with Japanese soldiers, and they're wearing 1,000-stitch belts that are supposed to kind of be bulletproof and ward off evil, and they're stitched by their girlfriends. So there's tremendous female support for the war at the home front, and the government is very aware of this. The country cannot succeed unless men and women take part and work together.
At our graduation ceremony from Army Training School, the Emperor came on a white horse. I felt that the Emperor was personally calling me to help him. That's when I thought I could die for him. In Japan, it is said that Emperor and the country are one. To serve the Emperor and to serve the country, it is all the same objective. That's Bushido, the way of the warrior.
Meanwhile, during the spring of 1942, the US Navy dedicates itself to recovering its Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Japan's attack there has failed to eliminate the American naval presence in the Pacific. Under the command of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet wants revenge, and it won't be long before Japan gets a taste of its own medicine. New Guinea, 1942. Japanese troops control the north of the island. But in order to strengthen its ring of steel, Japan must seize the Allied base of Port Moresby to the south.
One of the unstable areas on their perimeter was around New Guinea, towards northern Australia and so on. And in 1942, there was the first real clash.
Australian forces are successfully holding back the Japanese from advancing in the north. Determined to hold on to this essential Allied airfield, the United States sends reinforcements.
Stayed in Brisbane for a very short time, and then they sent us to Port Moresby, and that was the place that the Japanese had not been able to take on account of the Owen Stanley Mountains and the Australians who had fought them. If you had a map of New Guinea, you would see that was about the only place that was left.
Convoy en route to Port Moresby. Troop ships in the Coral Sea with Americans and Australians bound for secret bases in New Guinea. Nearing port, a Hudson bomber of the Royal Australian Air Force escorts them into the harbor.
The Japanese mission to take full control of New Guinea begins when Japan's Imperial Navy bombs Port Moresby.
When their planes, the Zeros and the bombers, came over, we got a real shock. People couldn't understand why they were advancing the way they were. There was Australian troops with anti-tank guns there. They were stopping a few tanks, but they didn't start pushing back at all. The Japs kept coming.
It's a struggle for Allied air forces to defend the base, so Admiral Chester Nimitz dispatches 2 US aircraft carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington.
Oh, yes, I can recall the Lexington, the aircraft carrier we were alongside. I couldn't get over the size of it. It was just huge. And to see airplanes taking off from that was beyond belief.
In response, the Japanese Imperial Navy sends their own carrier fleets, hoping to intercept. Coral Sea, May the 4th, 1942. Miles of open ocean stretch between the US and Japanese navies. But both carrier fleets scramble their aircraft, trying to be the first to attack each other's carriers.
The Coral Sea is one of those key naval moments where aircraft carriers, they can't see each other, and they're fighting.
Anti-aircraft fire sends planes crashing into the Coral Sea. The air attacks are devastating.
We were coming in with torpedo planes, we get hit with 5 torpedoes. And each torpedo blew a hole about 100 square feet. Tremendous explosion. The whole thing shattered. The ship's leaning a bit. Fire was burning. There were a couple of them bombs that landed. They broke our high-octane gasoline lines that we used to fill our airplanes.
Both fleets suffer extensive damage, but neither side emerges victorious. Japanese carrier Shoho is sunk, and the USS Lexington is damaged beyond repair.
Finally, they said, abandon ship. I was completely covered with crude oil, so I started kicking and swimming. I must have swam for at least 2 straight hours, just, never stopping, just trying to get away from them.
This carrier versus carrier battle shows that the rules of war at sea have changed.
Much of what Yamamoto's strategy revolves around are destroying aircraft carriers. If you can't control the air and the sea around the islands, the units that are on those islands will starve. They can't get the supplies they need. So aircraft carriers are absolutely crucial for projecting power in that way. And this is the reason why the Japanese continually seek out US aircraft carriers to destroy them.
The Pacific Ocean, Midway, June 1942. This strategic US refueling base is Japanese Admiral Yamamoto's next target.
Yamamoto developed the idea that what you needed was some major engagement with the heart of the US fleet. But they needed to find an objective which would lure the American fleet into the middle of the Pacific. So they decided that they would occupy the small island of Midway. What they failed to achieve at Pearl Harbor, which was the complete annihilation of the American fleet in the Pacific, they would now achieve in the Battle of Midway.
The Japanese forces to be committed were overwhelmingly superior, and the American carrier situation was critical. Lexington has just been sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and in the same engagement, the Yorktown had sustained damage, which made it problematical whether she could get back in time to participate in Midway's defense.
On June the 4th, Japan's Imperial Navy approaches the island of Midway. But the attack is no surprise.
Evidence that the enemy had already discovered or strongly suspected the Japanese advance towards Midway mounted sharply during the day.
The Americans, by extreme good luck, managed to break enough of the naval code to understand exactly what Yamamoto was planning.
The storm of the battle was about to break, and for the first time in 6 months, fate did not seem to be smiling upon us. No change, however, was made to the operational plan. The loudspeakers barked out the command, "Start engines." A Zero fighter leading the flock of impatient warbirds revved up its engine, gathered speed along the flight deck, and rose into the air, to the accompaniment of a thunderous cheer.
Japan's Navy sends more than 100 aircraft to attack Midway. But little do they know that the US fleet is moving into position to target Japan's carriers.
As we approached the Japanese fleet, they looked like little water bugs, and some big water bugs. Those were the carriers.
At about 9:20, our screening ships began reporting enemy carrier planes approaching. Some of our machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts at them, but it was too late. And a number of black objects suddenly floated eerily from their wings.
It takes about 22 seconds to go from, say, 22,000 feet down to 1,500 where you release the bomb. In that period of time, of course, you can see 4 or 5 planes ahead of you. Then you can see bomb hits, misses, and explosions on the deck and so forth. And immediately after release, turned to counter the Zero attack. Of course, I'm in the middle of the Japanese fleet. Now the problem is how to get back to the carrier with the amount of gas that we got.
US intelligence gives the Americans a clear advantage.
The Americans know where the Japanese are going to be for the most part at Midway, and they take a risk. But that gamble pays off because not only do they catch the Japanese somewhat off guard at Midway, and the Americans sink a strong portion and, of course, inflict great damage on the Japanese.
Coming back to a bridge, I could see that Kaga and Soryu had also been hit and were giving off heavy columns of black smoke. The scene was horrible to behold.
After 3 days, the Battle of Midway is over.
It was an extraordinary battle, won by the narrowest of margins. But it's hard to find a single battle in the Second World War, I think, which had more decisive implications.
Beginning of the war, the Japanese certainly have the upper hand. They've prepared, they're ready, they know war is coming because they've planned for it. What was daunting and shocking to the Japanese was the speed with which the American military machinery responded. And within 6 months, the Americans have learned how to produce, and they begin to very quickly outproduce the Japanese. But there's a big learning curve for the Americans, too, in terms of strategy and engagement. And in part, it's really Midway that demonstrates also the role of intelligence. And that is an issue that the Japanese continually ignored, much to their peril in many theaters of the war.
With Japan's naval capacities severely diminished, the US is ready for its revenge. But first, it must cripple Japan's defensive island empire. Washington, D.C., summer 1942. The US victory at Midway has Japan on its heels. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his generals are now eager to target Japan's island empire. This means troops on the ground.
The Battle of Midway was an old-fashioned naval engagement, which they won. But actually rolling the Japanese back from the necklace of islands that they'd occupied was going to be very different. These were difficult islands, sloping beaches, lots of jungle, difficult terrain. Here they had to fight a war with Army and Marine units.
In order for the US to be successful, Roosevelt must first rally his people. Eligible men are encouraged to enlist, others are asked to buy war bonds, and women are also urged to do their bit.
I went to work at North American Aviation there, and I worked in the B-25 plant, and I worked on the drill press there.
While I was working there, because our men were all gone, I was doing jobs that would have ordinarily been a man's job, but I could handle it.
I thought I was contributed to the war. I think it changed all of us. You know, doing our best to help the United States. I think it helped most of us.
Everybody was gung-ho for, let's get this done, get this war over with, and get our kids home.
The world's mightiest bomber plant is rolling. Henry Ford welcomes British and U.S. war supply heads Oliver Littleton and Donald Nelson. The schedule, one bomber every hour.
With the US war machine in full swing, Roosevelt and his generals are ready to take the offensive. Guadalcanal, August 1942. This tiny island at the southern tip of the Solomons is a strategic Japanese outpost. Now, it's the target for a US amphibious assault. American destroyers shell Japan's defenses. Planes from US carriers attack from the sky, and US Marines swarm onto the beaches.
Once the Americans land, the Japanese realize that they're there. They then launch a counterattack that's massive.
The fighting was bitter and mostly at close quarters.
It's one of these points in the war where you don't really know where the war is going to go. The US invasion force there was not destined to win. And if you read the accounts by Marines who were at Guadalcanal, it was pretty clear that they were just on the knife's edge of losing that campaign.
We had a lot of fights. The worst one was Guadalcanal. We were fighting at 125-degree temperature down in the deep tropics. That was the worst one we had. Even now, I kind of think about it, get a kind of chill. Right?
I'll tell you, the water was red with blood. It hit so damn many people. They were full of people, you know. And I think only about one transport may have beached itself where some people got ashore. Most of them were sunk right there. And you could see in the water, you could see the sharks and the blue water.
The invasion of Guadalcanal was the first American offensive in the Pacific. For the first time, the Japs lost ground.
To quote Admiral Halsey, he said, if we had lost Midway, it would have prolonged the war by many months, and if we had lost Midway and Guadalcanal, quite possibly could have lost the war.
United States Marines wiped out Japanese units defending their positions on Guadalcanal. A number of prisoners were taken. They seem to have lost a good deal of their arrogance. Perhaps they see which way the wind's blowing.
Guadalcanal is the United States' first experience of what will become a brutal war of attrition. A battle to seize Japan's empire, island by island.
Guadalcanal is indicative of the sort of battles the Americans will have with the Japanese in island-hopping warfare over the next several years. It's hot, it's incredibly uncomfortable, and it becomes a brutal war of back-to-back attacks. And what the Americans realize is that the Japanese have entrenched themselves so deeply, oftentimes, in these islands that they have to go almost man-to-man to get them off the island.
In the following months, the US confronts Japan at every island outpost, with landing after landing becoming a fight to the death.
Paratroop invasion of New Guinea, soldiers of the sky. And in command of Americans and Australians, General MacArthur.
Japan reinforces again and again in a desperate attempt to keep the Americans at bay.
The invasion of Tarawa with heavy losses in the landings was an epic of Marine Corps heroism.
The men who fought the campaign have taken another giant step to Tokyo.
If anybody ever tells you they weren't scared, they're liars. Absolute liars. Because I can remember one stand on the deck, and I watched the whole show, even before sunrise when they were shelling the island. And when that sun came up in the morning, the sky was this color. One of those red sunrises that was so just a glow. I went in the second day, in the morning of the second day. That's why I'm still here. It was 72 hours, but actually all the casualties were really in 2.5 days. We had 1,050 Marines killed, and I've forgotten how many thousand wounded. And there were 4,600 Japanese killed.
But many of the American operations in the Pacific were extremely costly. Tarawa is one where the Marines took extraordinary high losses. This was a particularly brutal war. Little quarter was given on either side. The Japanese were entrenched. They didn't want to give this up. They were not going to give this up easily.
There's certain times that just seem like a blank. I can still picture how crazy people are, or mankind is. I mean, it was such insanity. These were top-notch Japanese, some Marines and others, and being that early in the war, they wouldn't surrender for anything. If they did, their friends would shoot them. You know, you just didn't surrender.
I think once savagery starts, it escalates. There's a kind of tit for tat develops between the two sides. And so that in the end, the normal rules of engagement for both sides simply collapsed. The critical thing in the end for Japanese and American soldiers was just killing the enemy, one way or another.
The Pacific Ocean, 1943. The United States is attacking Japan's empire island by island. At sea, the US Pacific Fleet targets Japanese merchant ships in a bid to cut Japan's supply lines. American submarines play an essential role.
When we think about the history of the Second World War, I think we're very focused on the German U-boat war in the Atlantic. But actually, the most significant submarine war was a submarine war waged by the American Navy's submarine arm in the Pacific throughout the period 1942 and 1945. They sank everything they could find. By 1945, they were just sinking fishing vessels and junks because they couldn't find anything else to sink.
It was quiet sailing for a few days, and then we sighted a large convoy. The center of interest in this convoy was a huge tanker. We slipped under the destroyer escorts and fired 3 torpedoes from the aft tubes and 6 from the forward tubes. 2 of our torpedoes ran erratic, circling twice over our aft engine room. Oddly, these 2 torpedoes finally found targets in the convoy. Talk about dumb luck. We spent the next 90 minutes under severe depth charging. 40 depth charges were dropped on us at that picnic, 40 of them. We could hear the click-click of each detonator, followed by the exploding 600 to 1,000 pounds of explosive. After the Japanese escorts took off to protect the remainder of the convoy, we later learned it was the largest merchant ship sunk by U.S. submarines during World War II.
The effect of that was critical. It cut off the Japanese Navy from supplies of oil, but it also meant it was very difficult for the Japanese home islands to supply anything to their garrisons in the Pacific or in Southeast Asia or in China. It's estimated that more than 1 million Japanese soldiers actually died of starvation during this period because they simply cannot be supplied with food.
Total kills for my first patrol were 5 ships. I'm happy to say there was 5 fewer ships with their supplies and troops our forces would have to contend with on shore.
As the US breaks Japan's supply lines at sea, Japanese troops garrisoned across the Pacific are growing more and more desperate. In June 1944, American forces reach the Marianas. Their first target is the island of Saipan. The loss of life is shocking. It's clear that the Japanese are prepared to defend Saipan to the death.
There began then an inch-by-inch mop-up in which the enemy had to be cleaned out of caves, pillboxes, and holes.
American Marines use whatever means possible to defeat their enemy.
Because building construction is flimsier here than it is in Europe, flamethrowers are much more effective. Though a few may surrender, you'll probably have to kill a lot more than you'll capture, and you'll capture them one by one.
Rather than surrender, Japanese soldiers mount banzai charges.
What was particularly difficult for many of the Allied soldiers that they wrote in their diaries, they wrote post-war, when the Japanese kept, in their words, swarming in, even when the battle was obviously done.
They came out shooting and yelling and screaming, and they caught the mortar people right in there, and they killed 12 of them. And they would run through us, and they hit that wire. The one thing I can remember, I'll never forget, I seen them hooked in that wire, and I saw those machine gun tracers going down the wire, just cleaning them out.
I think the most fearsome thing in those banzai charges, you got a spear about that long, double-edged, leaf-shaped. You cut a guy in half with that thing. 2 guys got shot first in all Japanese attacks. One was the guidon barrel, and the other was the first guy that showed a samurai sword. Everybody wanted to get rid of that sword before it got to them.
The Japanese have now altered their strategy that everything has become a kessen, a final battle. Every island really kind of almost from Saipan on. As the Japanese are retreating, there's a series of these final battles which become more and more horrific in a sense of the lengths to which the Japanese soldiers are willing to defend.
Their attitude was far different from our attitude. There was no question about that.
Our enemy seemed to be a savage animal, a beast, a devil, not a human at all. And their only thought is to kill, kill, kill. Because it was against their heritage, their training, their belief. They would not surrender. All was left to a final charge, a pouring in of all their troops into one concentrated place, with their pledge to take as many of us with them as possible.
You never really will know why these Japanese soldiers were committing themselves. Some people simply believe that if we don't defend this island, the Americans will bomb our families back home. Others believe that the Americans will take them and simply kill them anyway. And also because there was a lot of propaganda about the brutality of the Americans. So is it any mystery then that the Japanese don't surrender to the US Marine Corps?
When these guys, the Marines and the Army or others are out in the field and in the brush, they're not getting enough food. The Army's messing up everything in sight. And the Army did screw up on Saipan. Americans did do stuff. Sometimes the stories of taking prisoners out to a ship, but it would take less time for the round trip the stories taking them out and throwing them overboard. I can understand some of this because when friends have been killed and all this in the war, but I don't care what it is, you can't do it.
The horrors of Saipan extend beyond the troops to the civilian population.
By this time, Japanese women and children were beginning to emerge from the caves in which they had taken refuge.
The enemy was hopeless. Of course, they brainwashed the civilians, and what they did, the women and children, well, the woman would throw off her babies over the cliff, and they'd jump right after the children. The Jap soldiers, some of them, they just pushed them off and everything like that. And it was a horrible sight and everything. And that blue ocean, that blue sea, in no time at all became the Red Sea. It was the most disgusting thing to see in my life, I'll tell you that.
You hear all the horror stories and so on, but that was probably the most brutal thing I've ever seen a human do to another.
As Japan's island strongholds weaken, the loss of life is devastating to the local population. But the cost to Japan's war effort is even greater. Tokyo, 1944. Japan is struggling badly in its efforts to continue to fight the war. Resources are stretched to the limit. The strain of it all weighs heavily on Japan's civilians.
The militarists in Japan wanted Japan to continue to fight to the bitter end, and they wanted to execute or imprison people who were accused of defeatism and so on. And by that stage, the Japanese population was facing the prospect of starvation.
Back then, it was inconceivable that the emperor could make a mistake. He was a god. Once something had been announced, they'd have to try to justify it, and one lie would lead to another until the whole thing became a big lie.
Nobody complained about it. We were part of a divine country centered on the emperor. The whole Japanese race was fighting a war. Those war years were a time where we were held in by everything. We had to worry about the country, what the people around us were thinking. We were completely repressed.
People in Japanese cities always suspected that they would be attacked from the air, especially as news began trickling in of the failures of the Japanese military to defend the outer rim of the empire. That means that the US Air Force is coming closer and closer and closer to the home islands. If you look at the diaries of civilians in Japan, they're very clear and very aware that this means that they're going to be attacked.
While Japan is undoubtedly faltering and an American victory seems inevitable, the war in the Pacific is far from over. The island of Leyte, October 1944. US forces reached the Philippines almost 3 years after being forced from the islands by the Japanese. General MacArthur has returned.
Japan, they know that once the US takes the Philippines, it's going to be an important peg in the whole design of creating infrastructure to attack the home islands of Japan.
In a desperate attempt to lure US support away from the landings, the Japanese Navy mobilizes its remaining ships.
The chips were down for the heaviest surface action of World War II.
The diminished Japanese Navy is no match for the might of the Americans, but they're prepared to sacrifice all. Kamikaze pilots descend on the US fleet.
Our first experience with those, we were operating with aircraft carriers Hancock, Cabot, and the Intrepid.
3 Japanese planes flew across that convoy, and they were low enough that you could look up and recognize them. They were flying across that convoy to pick out the ships they wanted to hit.
They started diving in at us and shooting at us. We shot back at them.
Nobody hit any of them. They circled around, came back,
and one of them hit the ammunition ship on our starboard side. And when it blew up and we went by it, you couldn't see a piece of it as big as your shoe. The other one hit the gasoline ship, and the same thing happened.
When local commanders are given impossible orders, you must defend this island to the death, but you only have 40 planes, then there really are a limited number of options for you.
Now you talk about a guided missile. When you got a plane riding a bomb, a pilot riding a bomb, that's all the planes were, just a flying bomb.
Where they were able to conduct kamikaze attacks, they were devastating, not just in terms of damage to ships, but also damage to morale.
Despite the horror of the suicide attacks, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a resounding victory for the US. Japan's 4 remaining carriers are sunk. The Imperial Navy is no longer a threat. With the Japanese in retreat, next to fall is the Philippine capital, Manila.
February the 3rd, 45, I moved in the city of Manila and helped liberate the city. We moved in so fast, we trapped him in there with a lot of Army and Japanese Marines.
True to form, Japanese troops fight to the last man.
It was house-to-house fighting against an enemy who prefers suicide to surrender.
In furious desperation, the Japanese lash out at Manila's inhabitants.
They put a torch to the city. They raped all the Catholic orders and all the nuns and everybody, and they killed about 80,000, 90,000 civilians.
The Japanese viewed the Philippines with a lot of suspicion. That means that when the Japanese military felt that its back was against the wall, this led to some of the more infamous massacres of civilians.
I saw people being beheaded in the street. They were barbaric. They're just beasts.
The Japanese are kind of tilting at windmills in this time of war in late 1944. And again, it kind of brings up this question, well, why not at this point then do the Japanese not think about ending the war? There is great fear. What we have done to our occupied people is going to be done to you by the Americans.
Now the US has Japan's home islands in its sights. But the Japanese still believe that if they keep fighting and refuse to surrender, they can still win victory. The United States needs to find a way to finally bring the bloodshed to an end.